Hello, very beautiful community. It's day 4 at home for me after 21 days in hospital, and I think I have never felt more profoundly ill while doing a chat. But if you look into my eyes, keep looking, you can see how extraordinary my mental health is. You can see it? You can see it. If you want health updates, we always have some on the Vlad Diary channel, but also just on the um, uh, community post bits of the main channel and here on the chat channel. Jord B. Peterson. A very requested video for many, many months from the community about the claim that Jordan Peterson seems to have made that the Nazis may have been the radical left instead of the radical right. We're going to react to it like mature adults who want to come away from the conversation knowing more. So let's rock and roll.
Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Well, what do we
because
consider?
It was a national socialist movement for a reason.
Okay. Let's leave the rather silly remark, nobody's done an analysis on that yet, because actually Jordan Peterson says something later about this, and we'll come back to it. Let's run it again, in fact.
Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done
it's
the
an open
analysis
question
properly yet to determine
to
that.
what degree
what do we
Hitler's
consider?
Because it was a
policies were
national
left-wing or right-wing.
socialist movement for a reason.
So I do think I recommend rejecting that. What happens here is that we have got not just an elementary misunderstanding of ideology, but an elementary misunderstanding of what it means for humans to live under culture. If you look at yourself in the mirror, you're going to see something kind of funny. But if you think about what kind of thing you are, you're a kind of neurophysiological entity, and you have a psychology. And the psychology you have is, in broad brushstrokes, the same as the psychology humans 10,000 years ago had. So it's something that's age-old, and it has universal features. And that's one fundamental truth. But there's another equally fundamental truth, and that's that your psychology radically underdetermines what happens to human beings when they live under culture. That's why when colleague or ex-colleague of Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, tries to explain the beginning of the Second World War in terms of evolutionary psychology, that's absolutely ludicrous, because that's precisely where you're not going to find an answer in generically universal materials of human psychology. Now, what you're going to need to do is you're going to find out what happened to these particular human beings under these particular circumstances, which doesn't mean the general psychology doesn't matter. It matters with all of its constructive and destructive propensities. But at the same time, all the juice will lie in the answer to how it has been in that particular instance culturally expressed. So you have a universal psychology, but you also live under culture that expresses that psychology with an enormous depth of variation, because that psychology is so skeletal, it dramatically underdetermines what happens under culture. And that's the context in which ideologies arise. Moreover, it's not just that ideologies arise under culture. It's that we're really only interested in talking about ideologies when it's ideologies that coexist or ideologies that clash. We can have an academic conversation comparing an ideology today with an ideology 2,000 years ago. But what we're fundamentally interested in is how ideologies that can actually meet each other in historical time conflict and interact. We're less interested in ideologies that could never meet each other because they occurred in different historical periods. So We're fundamentally interested in ideology when it comes to how it interacts with its rival and sibling equivalents under the same cultural circumstances. That's to say, we're interested in ideologies that push off from the same cultural circumstances, that push off from a cultural milieu with very many shared conceptions, with very many shared values, with very many shared expressions of values, with very many shared concerns. So it is not an accident, Jordan, for goodness sake, that Nazism shares an enormous amount with socialism, as it indeed does with conservatism. That's so because it's an ideology, and that's how ideologies work. The starting point for thinking about, let's blur the lines between Nazism and fascism because we don't need to get into that conversation today. But the starting point, how that ideology works, is that it brings together a socialist element and a conservative element. The conservative element is about a return to a past that never was. And the socialist element is a radical, vanguard, typically, transformation of society in order to return to a past that never was. The fact that fascism kicks off by bringing together in an extraordinary way socialism and conservatism doesn't make it socialist or conservative. It just shows the truth that we're interested in ideologies when they push off against the same cultural circumstances. And of course, there are many other features we could list, right? We could talk about the aestheticization of violence. We could talk about a kind of sacralization of the totalization of the state. We could talk about a kind of a visceral, somatic mobilization of the population, right? We could say 5, 7, 11 things more. But when we're doing this, we're not going to be defining qualities that are unique to a particular ideology. We're going to be rather defining the boundaries of what an ideology is, which is a sort of embodied way of negotiating the political world that is full of not just beliefs but all images too. You can't propositionally elaborate what an ideology is. Right? It's full of all kinds of images that are semi-retreated into the subconscious. And it's a sort of way of negotiating the political world that has extremely blurry boundaries and has enormous overlap with other, often as we might think, opposite ideological constructions. So the idea that we should be shocked by a socialist element or socialist motivation and therefore question whether fascism, Nazism, are a distinct ideological entity, right? Not distinct in some definitional sense, but distinct in the sense we're talking about singularly. The idea that we should question that just because it's this kind of blur, as we've elaborated, is ridiculous. It's no less silly than arguing that bruschetta is really a margherita pizza because it's got the basil and tomato in it. Let's go on.
One of the things I would have done if I would have been able to hang on to my professorship at the University of Toronto would have been to extract out a random sample of Nazi policies and strip them of markers of their origin and present them to a set of people with conservative or leftist beliefs and see who agreed with them more. And that analysis has never been done as far as I know. So we actually don't know. And we could know if the social scientists would do their bloody job, which they don't, generally speaking.
So there is something wrong with that. What is it? It's not entirely useless to conduct an experiment like that. I mean, it's more useful than trying to study fish by observing them from the surface of the water with binoculars. But the problem is that it's not much more useful than that. And that's because in the first instance, in the 12th instance, in the 112th instance, making sense of whether a certain political project is radical left or radical right, it's going to be a matter of interpretation. And one historian, like Richard J. Evans, between 10 past 10 and 10:15 in the morning on a Sunday, will, in 5 minutes, get you much further along the way than some kind of experiment in a soc sci department where you gather up people who profess to be left or right and make them tick boxes. Because of how ideology kicks off from culture, because of how ideology shares relations of family resemblance with its opponent ideologies, because of how ideology brings together beliefs, images, beliefs that have partly retreated into the subconscious, because it has blurry boundaries. The soc-sci move that Jordan is recommending there is, for all intents and purposes, a gimmick, and an embarrassing gimmick, because people who know will know that it's a silly remark to have made. But the majority of Jordan's audience will say, okay, science, the scientific method, maybe there's something good there. It's strange that Jordan, who himself constantly insists on interpretation, makes that remark, you might think, but it actually isn't. You might say it's strange because, all you need to do is ask Jordan whether God exists, and he will say, man, depends on what you mean by God. It exists, and depends on what you mean by the question mark, man. The question mark, man. Now, I've done something intentional now to actually make an important point, and that's that while it's right to say that Jordan Peterson's tears, we're going to do a little tear breakdown here, that's very important because Jordan cries all the time in public. Jordan Peterson's tears are, in a way, self-obsessive, but in a way, they're actually really not. And it's that second bit I want to emphasize. They are self-obsessive in the sense that when a public figure like Jordan Peterson cries about somebody's story that's been shared with him, the tears are more about Peterson than that story. On the other hand, if you give that same story to Tony Robbins, Tony, whatever you think of him, is going to cry about that other person, not about himself. But apart from that, I actually want to say that I don't feel comfortable with this mockery I've just replicated that occurs all over the internet. And that's because for biologic more than for psychologic reasons, Peterson is beset by a kind of imminent threat of doom beyond doom, inconceivable darkness that's so bad that it's worse than any physical illness that might befall a person Jordan feels, and perhaps not without justification. And Jordan manages to ward off this darkness and function. And this is not a darkness that's a product of his psychological flaws. It's actually a product of biology largely, and it runs in their family together with autoimmune disease. So, funnily enough, these somewhat self-indulgent tears are actually an illustration of physiological deregulation, which on the whole, Jordan Peterson handles with a determination and a faith and a courage that is out of the reach of most humans. And if I would say something positive about Peterson, it'd be that. I think the way he keeps on walking, despite this biologically imposed doom on him, is truly extraordinary. But let's back out of this cul-de-sac and return to the point that Jordan has instability around what's a matter of interpretation and what's a matter that can be investigated by methods continuous with the natural sciences. And what's so funny here is that Peterson tries to extend social interpretation to the realm of the natural sciences where it largely doesn't apply. And then, having pushed interpretation where it shouldn't go, he becomes lazy and loose about conceding in the realm of explaining the social world pockets of explanation to methods that jettison interpretation even when it's necessary. So he overreaches with interpretation, and as a part of this overreach ends up underreaching it. And the reason this whole problem occurs for him is around this problem he has of instability in distinguishing between scientific and non-scientific explanation. But now let's ask a very important question. Would Peterson have said what he said in 2024 about how fascists and Nazis might be radical left if we go back a few years? What would he have said in 2017? Let's watch him then.
To the degree that you regard nationalism and racial identity as primarily right-wing views, then the Nazis would have been right-wing. So let's say that maybe they pulled from the worst of both extremes, something like that. But I do think it's reasonable to note that their extreme nationalism and ethnocentrism and racial identity probably has more in common with the radical right than it does with the radical left, which tends to be utopian universal. So
probably has more to do with the radical right is a different answer in 2017 to 2024. What's happened? Is this a change of mind? I don't think so. Is this grift? Well, in the narrow sense of grift, saying something you don't mean to get points, it's not. But is it drift, algorithmic drift, and a kind of audience and algorithm capture effect? Then yes. It serves Peterson to manipulatively say, and I'm attributing manipulative intent to that remark of Peterson, more than deceptive intent. I don't think it's a deceptive intent. There's a manipulative intent there. To the remark, oh, it could be the radical left. You never know, because the radical left is bad. It's all out there. It's where all of our problems lie. And of course, interestingly, in the way I won't analyze today, Peterson's attribution of the toxic disease that he, to a degree early on, rightly identified, of hyper-identity politics, his attribution of that liberal disease, right? It's a version of hyper-liberalism, a virtue of benign liberal norms like inclusivity and the quest for recognition, getting out of control and becoming part of a certain kind of professionalized class one-upmanship game. That story has virtually nothing to do with the left. It's a kind of liberal deformation, but Peterson thinks it's a sort of a sub-Marxist enterprise by mistake. It's a mistake. It's entirely liberal. Hyper-wokeism is entirely liberal. So that's a mistake he makes, again, of inappropriate attribution of something to the radical left that shouldn't be attributed to the radical left. And I say that as somebody who is certainly not from the radical left. There's enough wrong with the radical left. You don't need to attribute things to it that aren't wrong with it. Now, what we've got here is a situation where you have a blend of thinking what it is convenient to think, because that's what it serves for Jordan. That's what it serves Jordan to say to his audience. And also a bit of a manipulative intent. I'm going to play around with this and shake things up. Maybe if I manipulate things in this way, it'll just further emphasize to the world the ubiquitous, variegated threat that the radical left constitutes. So diagnosis, not deception, but algorithm capture and a bit of manipulation. Sincere algorithm capture and a bit of manipulation. But now an interesting question arises, and because I sort of nearly died a few weeks ago and I'm not out of the woods yet, I'm going to be more unbuttoned in how I speak with you going on to the Future Beautiful community. And I'm going to say more things that are more liable to being misinterpreted. I'm going to do this in the manipulative ambiguity mode we've just witnessed from Peterson. I'm going to do it in a very direct and open mode, but it's going to be helpful to go there, especially at a time when we're drifting into an accelerated mode of democratic decline together. It's important to be bold and clear. So here goes. One of the problems with critiques of Jordan Peterson in our culture is that virtually all of them come from people who are less intelligent than him. If you Google the problem with Peterson or Jordan Peterson fails epically while trying to make some point, I'm sure even though I haven't searched, if you Google this very topic, Jordan Peterson says the radical right is in fact left, you're going to have essays and commentaries by people who are probably less well-read than him and less articulate than him, and perhaps overall less intelligent than him. And that's created a real problem. And that's what's actually wrong with Jordan Peterson is virtually never properly discussed. Because the people who are smarter than Peterson have no reason to speak to him. Right? Why would Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, Peterson's compatriot, whatever, colleague, not the right words, why would Charles Taylor ever interact with Peterson, except perhaps on a radio show where Chuck is asked, well, you've come across Jordan Peterson, any thoughts on him as a cultural phenomenon? But that's highly implausible. So virtually nobody who is smarter than Peterson ever commentates on him. Peterson himself is very conscious of this. He's very conscious that he is smarter than his critics and that the people who he would look up to intellectually actually don't want to talk to him. You can see it in some of the interviews. On the rare occasions when Peterson's talking to somebody who is in some significant dimension smarter than him, he slows right down and does the very opposite of what he did here with poor Destiny, where he just tried to trample Destiny by being aggravated in his interaction. And Destiny tried with a kind of hyperactive way to get all the facts and reasonable points out. I think it would have worked for some people, would have worked for Destiny fans, but the cumulative effect of that conversation is Jordan ran Destiny over. Now, when I hear Peterson speak to some people who he might look up to intellectually a bit, the top of my head, maybe I'm thinking of an interview with Ian McGilchrist on Peterson's channel. Peterson slows right down. So Jordan knows this. Jordan knows this, right? He knows that Charles Taylor or Alistair McIntyre or Raymond Goyce have no reason to respond to him. But the effect this has generated is that he has never been properly debunked. And by debunking, I don't mean saying that Jordan shouldn't be saying what he's saying, not at all. He's very welcome to say what he's saying. By debunked, I simply mean that serious observations haven't been made about some of the things that are going wrong in his public contribution. I'm going to name just one. I could name 7. I have promised a long-form video on the Peterson phenomena at some point on the main channel, but I think it's unlikely to come soon. One is that the overwhelming majority of Peterson's critical remarks about our society take the form of complaints rather than social explanation. Now, there is a structural risk of that always with the ethical nostalgia you get in culturally critical conservative commentary. To a degree, you encounter the same problem in Christopher Lash, where you have more complaint than social explanation. And so you often have maybe even a legitimate claim made about what's wrong with our culture, but a sort of a kitsch evacuation of any serious conversation of how the problem got generated, where it's come from, what it makes, what we should make, therefore, of our current predicament, how stuck we should feel where we are, how much we can change it, and who we might become in the future. All of that's missing from Peterson. You get relentless complaint, devoid of any serious social explanation. And it's okay that Jordan isn't a political animal. Nietzsche wasn't a political animal. Jordan's hero, Nietzsche. But Nietzsche gave psychological, cultural, historical explanation about how we ended up where we are, about who we were, and where we might go. He wasn't just saying, I don't like this and I don't like that, which is incidentally an expression of consumerist behavior. Very kind of behavior that Peterson himself finds worth critiquing. Not just because it's sort of spiritually empty, but also because it's about following the crowd in a way that he doesn't approve of. But the reality is, Peterson's complaints are consumerist to a very good extent because they lack the substance of historical explanation. Complaint without explaining is not okay. So just a small flavor of some of the things that are actually going wrong there, that you're simply not receiving in the essays and video contributions and podcasts you might be encountering. But circling back to the very, very delimited point we tried to engage with today, can you place fascism or the Nazis on the radical left? No. Can you get anywhere near the answer to that question via conducting a glib and scientific social experiment in a psychology department? No, you can't. Is that kind of experiment utterly useless? Well, it's not utterly useless, but then you could argue that observing fish from the surface of the water with a pair of binoculars is not utterly useless either. Lots of love.